Isla, thank you. Comments are much too generous. I always think talking about somebody else. I wanted to talk tonight about 5 projects that are in the office, both as a pretty standard kind of description of the project, but I also wanted to weave and kind of swerve into certain ideas that the project, each of the projects sort of elicited. I guess I could say, relative to projects like the Atlas of Novel Tectonics, the book, we typically use the design projects as a vehicle for speculating, on kind of the wider implications potentially of the work. So design for us is extremely important. The feedback from an actual design is what really propels the theoretical project, and there's a kind of reciprocity that we try to kind of set up where we have working assumptions that might guide the design, and probably those assumptions come from a previous design project, and that working through the project not only means working it out, but it also means that afterwards there's a potential for speculating on a more general set of possibilities that the project would produce. And the project is the only thing that can really generate those ideas. It's not something, at least from our practice, that can be done a priori, but that the ideas are really coming and the speculations are coming from the work. So I guess I'll just go into it. The project, first, the Kaohsiung Port Terminal, which, as Isla mentioned, is currently under construction. Date is wrong. As usual, the project has had some delays, but it is in the ground. It's in the southern port of Kaohsiung in Taiwan. It's really part of a wider kind of initiative to rejuvenate what is essentially one of the biggest container ports, in Taiwan. And they want to bring, I guess what makes it interesting in that sense is that, like many cities, they want to bring the public to the waterfront, make an accessible public waterfront. But at the same time, this is an active waterfront. So that was one of the primary challenges. But there was a demand to create a new port terminal as well as a port of authority in Kaohsiung. And this new building would handle a whole range of scales and types of ships as part of a larger network that connects actually to Japan and ultimately to mainland China and in Korea. So these port terminal projects and the competitions around them, which started more or less in 1995 with the Yokohama port terminal, continue now and kind of expand the network, into the mainland. So, as I mentioned, the site, is an active port, and so our concept really kind of revolved around the idea that the edge shouldn't be seen and zoned as one surface, but it necessarily would have to be evaluated and developed in section. And the general diagram, was a kind of a sandwich where the industrial port operates at grade by the bulkhead. Terminal would be then sandwiched between that service layer and an elevated public space, which would extend almost the full edge, if we had hoped. So we were asked not only to design a building, in other words, but also to produce a master plan for a large segment of the edge. And so it was very important to evaluate the project first, in terms of the grounds it occupied, and then also how the networks fed that site. So began really more as a planning project and then zeroed in on the building itself. So the building follows that tripartite kind of sectional idea. So the lowest most lever really is involved with the kind of the lower level kind of departure areas and all of the baggage handling, very much kind of sectionally like an airport. Then the middle datum, which cradles the building, also contains the kind of interfaces with the boardwalk and public space. And then, of course, finally, the building kind of nestles into that. And I'll go into that in a second. So there's a very clear distinction that we make at one level between the object building, which, had to be, in terms of the requirement of the competition, an iconic building. But at the same time, it's fed by pedestrian and vehicular infrastructure. So it's a kind of engaged object rather than being a completely discrete object building. It extends outward. And this is one of the views from within. The idea here was that you could enter at the main level and basically see all of the ways to the boats at that departure level. So the building itself is thought of as a kind of directional building, a kind of manifold that connects both to the boats, but also extends out to reach the boardwalk at another level. So then rather than a kind of a gridded kind of open field, it's really a kind of vessel, you could say. And that kind of notion of the vessel connecting into the kind of exterior also is reversible. The exterior penetrates the building, so the kind of interface between boardwalk and terminal is the occasion for the kind of restaurant programs, the public programs that could kind of interface between use in the terminal and use by people in the boardwalk. So this is a kind of cartoon section, which gives you an idea of, the connectivity and the circulation. Again, very much like an airport section, modified airport section. We had originally, in the first stage of the competition, tried to do a more romantic diagram, if you could call it that, where people were embarking and disembarking on the pier. But we were, quickly corrected by our collaborators at Arup, the logistics people, said that was really unrealistic, and it actually did kind of cloud the idea of really having distinct, functional layers in the project. So the building, is comprised of the Port of Authority Tower, which also has an interesting kind of public interface at its base, with an auditorium, and then three major lobes, each connecting to the various scales of boats and functions. So this is a plan. One thing I would, point out here is that we started to get very interested in the idea of working with the poché space of the building, that space between the walls, because it would allow us to produce very clear kind of directed spaces, and then we were able to put all of the vertical circulation ducts and so forth in those in-between spaces. So it becomes even clearer at the main level, at the departure level, where, that vertical circulation kind of is housed within the space, within the in-between space, and then you get very kind of smooth and relatively simple volumes. And then at the uppermost level, those interfaces again, connect to the public uses, the restaurants and so forth. And here you can also see the kind of performance and lecture hall that's at the base of the tower. So, that was also, in terms of program, a very important piece, because there was a real concern that that this building, is a very periodic building, meaning that, it's very active when boats are there, but there was a real concern about keeping the building vital and being used during the kind of downtime. So a whole series of other programs, which I'm not kind of showing in detail, are there, which will attract, they hope, a public during that point. So you can see, in the section, that kind of connection to the boardwalk, and then even higher level uses, in the section looking out, and then all connected to the circulation within the wall. So this is a photograph of the site recently. It's going through a period of remediation. This was owned by one of the big oil companies in Kaohsiung, so they're pumping oil out of the ground for the next 4 or 5 months, and then construction will actually begin sometime in March of next year. So the 014 tower, as Isla mentioned, was completed in 2010. And it was really the first occasion for us to be in, kind of finally construct, a large-scale building. So we were very fortunate, actually, in the circumstances to get that project. But I would want to just describe a little bit about the kind of peculiar nature of Dubai, that really, everyone knows the Palm Island, but in fact, you could argue that each of the kind of themed mini-cities within Dubai are in themselves islands. They are, relatively monofunctional. They kind of connect to their theme. They have their own sort of circle of infrastructure around them, and then they connect to one of the large thoroughfares along the water, Sheikh Zayed Road, and then now I think there are about 3 layers of highways connecting, to this constellation, these kind of islands of, programmed cities. And much of the work was done by these large engineering firms like Halcro, kind of done remotely, kind of create these, very strange environments, I would say, these themed environments as cities. But, just extraordinary, the amount of growth, at least up to the economic downturn a few years ago in 2008, just the quantity of building and the ability to essentially generate an instant city or instant cities remotely. But I would argue that, that kind of mechanism isn't so unique just to Dubai, but, one could argue that very similar kind of urbanism emerges in places like Kuala Lumpur or Shanghai. And, they start with these master plans here, the Business Bay rendering that we received when we first got involved in a major international competition to design the center where that little globe is in the center of the drawing, to design this enormous hotel and residential tower and business tower, an 84-story tower. But this was the reality of the site when we got there, kind of blistering heat, and that little flag was that center, the place of the center tower. So you can see Nanako over on the right, shielding herself. So these were, it was a competition, and we were up against, some formidable people. Ultimately, Zaha Hadid won the competition with the dancing towers. But we were fortunate enough to be noticed by the organizer of the competition, who was a young developer who worked at that time for Dubai Properties, and then went off on his own to create his own development company. So his first desire was to get us to make a 22-story office tower with essentially the same formal characteristics as an 84-story tower. We went through more than 16 iterations. It was ultimately, not possible, so we kind of pulled back and really had to rethink what the, possibilities were for, an office tower in Dubai. What kind of architecture should, we be approaching? And we were really kind of struck by Rem Koolhaas's board. One of the images on the board, essentially to present, his building surrounded by both kind of speculations on what his competitors would produce, but also, pushing forward this idea that, the best antidote to the profusion of kind of formal invention would be a return to a kind of severe modernist prism. So, it has a long and durable history within modernism, and it certainly, Rem Koolhaas's rendering, resonates and harkens back to, some of Mies van der Rohe's renderings where, the new kind of modernist prism or crystal is then juxtaposed to the 19th century city. We were interested in some other way of kind of dealing with the situation of the tower. It being inherently, a kind of cosmopolitan structure. It's not so affected in a way by the local, but it's more kind of formed by its own kind of peculiar economy and, of course, the new economy. So that idea of a new cosmopolitan typology became really fascinating for us. And it led us to, in a way, put aside, at least for this project, an overly elaborate building in terms of form, but to think through another way of articulating the building, of producing the structure and the space, away from the kind of typical curtain wall buildings that you see everywhere in Dubai. So this is an excursion into some speculation here. The three different avatars of the cosmopolitan, I call it. The first being Magritte's Palm Souk, which would be a certain kind of early man without qualities modernism, the kind of reduced modernism. Leonard Zelig, and then Chauncey Gardiner. So modernism, the quality of no qualities, kind of 0 degree condition for the building, and the notion that kind of corporate everyman as a building could be deployed anywhere. Then a more recent phenomena, which I call the new colonial, which would be kind of hyper-contextualism, like Leonard Zelig, if any of you have seen Woody Allen's old movie, where he becomes anything he's close to. And then the model that kind of fascinates us, almost a kind of doppelganger to the modernist, right, to the Magritte, is the Chauncey Gardiner figure in Being There, where essentially Gardiner becomes the person upon which all of the meanings get projected. While he essentially is the same, he's constantly being read and understood in radically different ways. So with the O14 building, it has been kind of connected to various kind of material and historical models, and all of those, I would argue, are correct. It's also had its own interpretations done, which are somewhat out of our control, but it's part of it. and resonating with, a history of architecture like Melnikov's building. The Russians were absolutely convinced that 014, derives from the house. Actually, it was not really on our radar, but retrospectively, not so far off either. And then, of course, the building has, kind of fulfilled its sort of role as an iconic building. It kind of got recognition in the kind of souvenir building market. You can see over 14 down there with the Taj Mahal and all the rest. But we were really interested in this idea that the minor arts somehow emerge everywhere and nowhere. I mean, in a very ancient way. I mean, people recognize the basket and the basket weave, as something that's, kind of emerges in parallel all over the world. And so that there's a certain recognition to that reticulated structure, kind of affinity people have. But it always looks local, but it actually isn't. And so as a kind of extended speculation on that, both materially, but also in terms of its cultural reception and the way it's perceived, we started to think through, what the advantages are, kind of working through these models. So, of course, on the material side, the fact that, it's comprised of non-essential parts, large areas can be removed. I mean, hopefully not, violently, but in terms of design, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility in the reticulated structure. It finds ways of rerouting forces. And more specific to the 014, that there were also sustainable dimensions to the building that kind of flow out of using the reticulated system in the right way. On the kind of reception and optical side, it was very interesting to explore the idea that one could produce a very relatively simple object. I should go back. But then through the deployment of a kind of disruptive or camouflage pattern, really change the notion of scale in the building. So I'm going to go further into speculation here. And it connects, I guess, to the idea of what the iconic might mean, and also a kind of shift that I perceive today. So kind of riffing on Walter Benjamin's text, the old text on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he talks about the kind of quintessential idea of the aura comes from something that's rooted and fixed and large, and it produces an aura and a kind of effect of a distance. Same thing could have been said about, a famous painting, an iconic painting like the Mona Lisa. But I would say that there has been a kind of shift of perception, perhaps due to just the ubiquity of, the reproduction of the image, where that sense of distance, in a sense, is lost in the original. The original becomes somewhat disappointing when you actually go and see it. It's limited in scale, it's old, it's no longer kind of filling the world in the same way that, that the reproductions do. And so trying to, I wouldn't say capture that, but trying to think through the potentials that are already in the technologies that we are working with, the kind of distancing that happens in the new technologies of production and fabrication. That was something that finally, for us, begins to emerge in the building. And I don't think it's just peculiar to our building, but I think it's part and parcel of the new forms of fabrication of buildings. The fact that much of the craft now kind of has migrated to the office rather than to the job site, and just the very kind of the strangeness of the new buildings. And that, kind of connects back to some of Benjamin's ideas, I mean, there are, in fact, are no originals here. It's an iterative process of design, so one is dealing with, many iterations and families of design, and design kind of moves, and then finally kind of zero in on one in particular. But it also, connects to what I perceive as a kind of reaction among, architects of entirely different stripes to this idea of a kind of encroaching sense of placelessness in the city, whether that's seen as something negative or whether that's seen as something that one should pursue. So on the kind of extreme side, I would say the American Folk Art Museum, which I have to say, was and, is a fine building. The sentiment behind it was to somehow, that the recognition, I guess, that modernism and honesty of materials was no longer working. So the material effect of the building had to be amped up. Hence the production of these, large phosphor bronze panels with the, with the texture, and really this attempt to kind of return to a sense of extreme presence through materials in the building, through an exaggeration of materials in the building on the one side, and then the asymptote project on the other, where the ambition really is to get the building to be as close as possible to the rendering on the screen, so that that the effect of the building should be closer to that than to any kind of sense like to see dust on that building or to see it in any way as kind of part of a reality that could change would be a negative thing, that it should ideally be light, be kind of built light. So we find ourselves in the in-between, I would say, that to try to work within the tension between those two poles for us is the most productive. On the one hand, not to slip into an overly assertive materiality, or to kind of transform the materiality into something that approaches geometry and materials together, and at the same time not to kind of go off on the other end of the pole towards a dematerialization of the architecture. So those are the kind of tensions that we are trying to play in the context of demands by developers and competition organizers for an iconic building. That's a foregone conclusion in most competitions of kind of large-scale competition. So it would be a mistake, we feel, to refuse that, but then one would need to find another way of addressing, how to, deal with the iconic. So this idea of the palpable abstraction for us, I think was a productive kind of intuition. And it even connects back to some, early experiences looking at the, Sea of Holes and the Yellow Submarine movie. But, to produce a facade, for example, where you do get a sense of kind of pushing and pulling, within the facade, or, to be, to have a sense of that the facade could kind of project you into it and into that field, was something that was really important for us. In a way tied to some of the aims of op art, I guess. On the material side and the perceptual side, I guess I derived this sense that it's not about a kind of older transposition argument, like in the 19th century, like the Greek temple starts wood and then becomes rendered in stone, but that rather what really interested us, and this connects back to the basket weave idea, that one would produce a highly tectonic kind of field of reinforcement, the basket, and that its kind of tensions are in some way imparted to the visual effect of the building itself. So, that also opens up this idea, which I guess is not so popular because it's been kind of maligned, the idea of expression in architecture, or expressionism, has been, routed to some very narrow interpretations, like, kind of engineering expressionism, say, on the one hand, or the attempt to erase expression on the other, the skin and bones of modernism. But we are really interested in the idea that the building does operate at some level as a kind of fictionalized fact, that that there's a way of working both with kind of the material forces that are kind of buried in the building. Those are part of its expression. But like a body, the cosmetic dimension isn't really in contradiction or superimposed, but actually could become integral to that model. I spoke a little bit earlier about, this idea of the scaleless, which I thought was very important in terms of a building in Dubai, especially when it's kind of placed among neighbors that are much taller. And so O14 notionally is actually created from two different models. One, a kind of a relatively simple, featureless monolith. In this case, it was the Pyramid of Cestus, which I saw in Rome and was really struck by its, at least in certain lights, you couldn't see the blocks. You couldn't really tell how large that pyramid was. At certain distances, it looked enormous. In others, it was actually, kind of surprisingly small. But kind of to use that in conjunction with a heavily featured facade, together. So just the overall anatomy I'll go through very quickly. All buildings in Dubai, kind of required a base structure. They typically filled them with cars. We convinced our developer that since the building was actually sited on a pretty prominent site by the creek, that he should, put the cars underground, and that we could actually use that base level, the kind of floating base building, as an extension of office and kind of program space, public space too. And the entire facade unrolled, which was one of the ways we worked through the kind of distribution of the openings, and also a kind of back and forth work at this level with the structural engineers, kind of coming up with certain rules of proximity for the larger holes, and how the structure, how the forces could flow through this field and finally go down to a very regular, actually, column grid below the ground. Another dimension of the building, which developed actually through the kind of design process, was its sustainable kind of part. Of course, we knew that going with an exoskeleton building with a kind of brise-soleil would help with solar heating and heat gain, light and heat gain. What we didn't realize at the beginning was that by separating that facade, separating that structure, actually that skeleton, from the interior of the building, created a stack effect and actually kind of substantially cooled the tower. So it actually started with more aesthetic concerns, actually. The idea of, we first had glazing in the holes. Then, because of tolerance issues, we realized that you'd get enormously fat frames, which would go against the kind of idea of this kind of open work. And so we moved the glazing a meter inward, did simple window wall instead between the slabs. And that opened up this whole idea of kind of working in the depth of the facade, using that kind of gap space, that 1 meter gap. This is a view from the roof when the shell kind of emerges, free of slabs. but that same gap gets modulated at the base as well. At the lobby, there's an even larger space, between shell and building, to kind of work with that in-between space. And one can actually look up and see almost all the way to the roof of the tower, because these tongues that connect the slab to the holes provide openings. And we also capitalized on the kind of perforation to be able to build bridges from the slab within to the kind of floating bar building that surrounds three sides of the tower. So the office space is kind of coextensive, from tower to bar. So this is a typical interior of the building. We didn't do the furniture design here. And then again, a view from the roof where you can see the shell emerging. It was a very interesting kind of construction process and also design process, really working closely with the local contractor, but also we had fabricators from the Beijing formwork company were brought to Dubai and did all of the kind of automated wire cut foam forms. But they still hadn't been able to, the contractor, it took a few months really to determine the best way to kind of locate the formwork in the most efficient way, and also to kind of speed up the construction of the tower, the pours. So the first levels took something like 2.5 weeks, and they finally got it down to about a week per level, which is still somewhat slow relative to other buildings, but given the complexity of the building, they did all right. But this kind of shows that exoskeleton above, it's probably kind of midway in the tower. So that's a 60 centimeter thick shell. Goes down, excuse me, that's 40 centimeters, goes down to 60 at the base. Moving to Taiwan, this was another competition that we won 3 years ago for really a complex of buildings that were commissioned by the Taiwanese government to finally recognize their pop music industry. The music industries of especially mainland China, in Korea and Japan, have really dwarfed the Taiwanese music industry, but they were really the originators of much of what we kind of see, kind of recognize as kind of East Asian pop. So they finally wanted to create a precinct in the city that would be both a place of production, performance, but also where they could roll out, new groups, as part of the kind of advancement of the industry. So the building, again, the demand was that it be an iconic project, and that the building would be as important on the television or through media as actually visiting the site. And that was something really explicit in the kind of demand of the program. So much of how we kind of worked through the project kind of recognized that. The other part of this project, which we really took very seriously, which was really not so much part of the brief, was that we didn't want to make a project that would just be suited, kind of periodic and suited only to performance, but that we could stage, consider this a precinct in the city that would be both used by people every day as a park, and for a lot of different uses, green markets and so forth, and that we actually had to felt it necessary to kind of propose a schedule of uses to keep this an active space, not a dead space. But again, the notion of the kind of recognizable icon was, part of the brief, and so we, thought through this idea that there would be a kind of a radical distinction between the fabric, albeit a kind of figured kind of urban fabric for the base, and then these object buildings that would relate to one another across the site, a kind of doubling. So there was a Hall of Fame building, which we called the Cube, and then an existing telecom building, which is connected to the site, which we had to kind of integrate into the site. And equally, this other kind of shell-like form being doubled but transformed, which would be for the main hall, and then the industry shell where they kind of have recording studios and so forth. And these would kind of occupy a kind of elevated plane above what we call the kind of fabric building, where the kind of the public would generally move. The industry themselves, we didn't need to add symbolism. The industry added their own in terms of their kind of how they would connect figures in the pop music world to the various kind of morphologies. So the more traditional people got connected to the cube by the industry. Kind of middle generation went to the crystal, and then a younger generation to the kind of main hall, the Green Mountain. So very interesting. I mean, that in a way to kind of work almost entirely on the formal dimension of the building, and that the symbolism almost accidentally gets assigned, to the forms. But it's something that's out of the architect's control. It's something that you don't want to do. But really the idea was to kind of tie these two sites together that were very difficult to tie. They're the very kind of long park site, and then this more, kind of polygonal site with the main hall. The program changed radically in terms of the main performance space over the course of the development of the project. So originally it was to be a kind of hybrid hall that could host Broadway shows but also have music. The music industry took over the project later in its development, and it's now an entirely kind of suited, it's a big fan-shaped building for 5,000 seats from 3,000, entirely suited, to pop performance. So, the idea that this place would really be not only for performance, but really become integrated into the city, have a certain modality of kind of public use and shopping during the day, and then move towards kind of performance, especially in the outdoor performance space at night. But also that those iconic elements would always be on this elevated horizon, that one could see them essentially from every point in the space was really important. And also to link the two sites together. There's a very typical kind of move in Taipei to use bridges over main roads. So there's an elevated datum for entry, into both the kind of north and south sides of the site. This is the main hall. And so the infrastructure, that kind of runs around the site then gets pulled into the interior of the building, almost kind of nesting idea where bridges then become balconies and salons around the kind of central core, which is the main hall, the main performance space. So the main lobby is really in this kind of interesting interface between the outside shell and then the kind of circulation spaghetti around this kernel of main hall. So this is the site. Fairly recently, they've begun an early basement for the main hall, and that long green stretch is the kind of north site, which will soon be under development. So I will, this is a kind of a short project. I just wanted to show a kind of very different kind of project. This was a competition that we just submitted for the main sort of campus of Adidas in Germany near Stuttgart. And the idea here was to really try to rethink the idea of the office the office block, especially in relationship to a company like Adidas. That to work with the idea that you could create a really expansive office plate, essentially on one floor, although with some mezzanines, but under one big roof, and to take advantage of, by elevating that kind of super plate, be able to really activate both the undersurface, the kind of belly of this beast, with programs that would kind of come off of that floor and then look into a lower garden, as well as kind of manipulating the upper surface as well for kind of skylighting a very deep office space. So this building had to kind of take on multiple roles depending upon your approach. So it became also a kind of gateway, to the campus. People had to kind of go through checkpoints through this garden and then be led to the various other kind of buildings on the campus. But it also, on its upper levels, had to house the 12 different sections that comprise, the Adidas Corporation. And, the idea being here that everybody would be essentially on one level, be in very close proximity. And could also, the challenge, of course, is that, and also because of the German laws, that you really had to have much of the perimeter, in contact with an outside, and also, through the use of skylighting, bring the outside down into this, kind of very kind of extended plate. So we kind of notched the perimeter to create subzones. I think there were something like 2 of each of their kind of functioning sections within a subzone, and then each of those subzones were marked by an elliptical kind of skylight that produced more intense light within a wider field of skylight. So that by changing the angle, there was a kind of focal point defined by light within the space. I should go back and have a look. Yeah. And then, we were also very interested in revisiting some of the early modernist, well, not early modernist, 60s like Bürolandschaft plans, not as chaotic, I suppose, although really the idea was that this plate could be entirely, open to the organization, put in place by Adidas. But we needed to suggest how it could be used. So we actually went through many different versions of kind of organizations, suggested organizations for, temporary and even more kind of permanent elements within the space to give them an idea of its flexibility. Okay. So the last project I'll be showing was in competition about 2 years ago for the Angewandte Kunst in Vienna, which many of you must know, houses an important, certainly, art and design schools, but, we all know it, through the involvement of people like Hani Rashid and Zaha Hadid, Greg Lynn, who are, the kind of present professors within the architecture program. But it also became an occasion for us to really think about what it is to produce a building that would, on the one hand, be very suited to, of course, this is the history, an illustrious history, but that this building would be suited to both the production of art and design on the one hand, but also be, part of the public realm in Vienna. Typically, it's very popular now to try to overly publicize, to make the building overly transparent or overly accessible. But we got really interested in kind of harnessing the logic of institutions on the Ringstrasse, to kind of revive certain elements of the 19th century idea, and to use that to kind of feed into the way that we feel this institution should best function. So this is a kind of overview of the site. There is a kind of a 1960s wing, which is by a canal, and then an older kind of 19th century building. It's also part of the complex that houses the Mack Museum. So, there's a kind of honorific entrance off the Ringstrasse, which of course was created, and it is very elaborate, to connect to the Angewandte on its public side, and also to the Mack through a big courtyard. So we wanted to hold on to that, but we also wanted to think about moving the students and professors to another entrance, which is along the Oskar Kokoschka Platz, and that would be only for them. And so the interface would be very specific, where you would have exhibitions, where you would have lectures. That's exactly where the public and the artists and architects would commingle, but you wouldn't allow, as part of the kind of the theater of the city and of kind of the idea of producing a work and kind of showing it, to keep the general public out of the production spaces. They could look in, but they couldn't go in. So our focus was really on this internal courtyard, to produce a building that would be both kind of physically appear to emerge, this addition, from the existing 1960s building, but that materially would have to be entirely distinct from it. So all of the structure couldn't impinge on the existing building, although we wanted it to look like it was kind of coextensive and emerged from it. So there's the kind of the large bar that extends seminar and production space off of each of the main levels for architecture and design and painting and so forth. And that bar, angled bar, rests on the one hand on the Oskar Kokoschka Place side on a library. The library becomes a kind of de facto gate for the academic side of the institution. And then that ovoid form on the right is the main lecture hall, which the general public enters high and then kind of descends down into kind of sunken courtyard space, and then the students approach low and enter from that level. So those are the two sort of kind of meeting spots. So this is a view from Oskar Kokoschka into that entrance, framed again by the library and then the bar above. And then kind of looking laterally from the 19th century building across the courtyard, seeing how the slabs of the existing building get extended into this new kind of truss bar. And then these are some descriptions about kind of the structural system, which was a kind of modified truss, where instead of a kind of typical Warren truss, which would be put probably on the external face of a bar, we made into a kind of crisscross. So the outer faces of the bar would be more transparent, and the structure would cross over and through the center of the space. So this is a kind of transverse section, almost like an engine block, I always thought, showing the kind of interplay between the two. From the lowest level of the lecture hall and the kind of large exhibition space that also, forms part of the public interface, so the general public would flow into that, into the lower portion of the bar building for kind of exhibitions. And then up another level to the library, which then extends, to the classroom and office levels. So this is a view down from the kind of typical, from into the library space. So yeah, the kind of production side, the kind of creation space rests on the kind of speculative and theoretical as a base. And, we were also really kind of inspired by, a certain view of Vienna through films like The Third Man, which used and kind of exploited the idea of what they call the Dutch angle, to think through what could happen, not out on the ring, not out on the kind of streets, but these very compressed and dynamic, potentials within the courtyard space. So, it having a very different presence internally than its sort of external appearance, and only kind of giving a suggestion of what, happens within. So that closes my lecture for this evening. I'd love to take questions.